It's the right time to make a start, I think. So welcome to everybody. And as usual, I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where we gather in person today, as we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I recognize the unique connection of the First Nations to country and their role for caring and maintaining country over tens of thousands of years. May long overdue justice be done to them, and may their wisdom and resilience be with us today. So, a warm welcome to everyone, online and in person. Let me just bring a couple of things to your attention. And we have among us, and special welcome to them, a number of young people who, well, young is a relative concept, who have been successful applicants for a bursary, and especially welcome. So please mingle during the breaks and engage in conversation. And I also welcome Ben, who's a stalwart at helping us out with technical management of issues, but of these events. And in Emily's absence tonight, he kindly stepped in first. Thanks, Ben. We have a number of facilitators, and if the numbers are a bit small, in some tables, you could merge with another table. In fact, that might be a wise thing to do. We'll know that by the time we're ready to break into small groups, which will be around about 7 o'clock. I think you all have received an outline of the 6 weeks program. And as I was saying last time, it's an attempt to put pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together in order to form an overall picture, if we can, at least not too blurry a picture of where things are at and where they might be heading in the foreseeable future. Now, I have a piece of bad news, which is unfortunate, but can't be helped. And that is that our speaker tonight won't be able to be with us. He was hospitalized at about 11 p.m. last night. He toyed with the idea of doing it from his laptop, from his hospital bed, but that didn't prove effective, or at least too troublesome. And the hospital suggested to him, not this time. So he's given me a couple of pointers as to how we can draw on his work nevertheless, and I'll be sharing that with you. The problem is we won't be able to ask him questions, which is a shame, but we will manage. And if he can join us in a later week, even though it may not fit into the topic for that week, we will see whether we can arrange it. All right. Well, what I want to do today is to just share with you a few observations, not much more than that, about the ethical implications of the new tech. Wide range, as we shall see. So if we move to the next slide, that's just the title that I've chosen for what I'm going to say, and the next slide. These are the areas that I propose to look at briefly. Technology through the ages, a bit of a focus on 2 existential threats and the link with technology as a lead up to a discussion of the ethical issues surrounding technological change, and then the weaknesses of the current ethical discourse in relation to technology, and just a couple of thoughts as to how we might do better. Well, the first thing is technology through the ages. And you have all been provided with this timeline, which is quite useful in order to make a number of key points about the evolution of technology, which has, as you can see, a very long history. Certainly, this particular timeline suggests that human beings have been around for about 300,000 years. Assessments vary, somewhere between 250 and maybe even more than 300. It becomes a bit blurred at the edges in terms of current scientific evidence. But what is made clear from that is the length of time between substantial technological innovation. At the earliest stage, the timeline was in terms of thresholds, was probably measurable in millions of years, pre-human. And then in tens of thousands of years. And then eventually in hundreds of years from, let's say, from around 2000 BC, many hundreds of years, and then just the odd 100 years, and then the decades. And now we're virtually year to year, dramatic changes. So what we're seeing is the increasing acceleration of change, which raises very profound ethical questions. And in addition, the reach. Previous technologies, technological innovations, at first reached a very small space and a relatively small population. And it took very considerable time to spread over space and the number of people involved. Whereas now, most changes, or many changes, become global within a very short space of time. So there is reach, increasing reach, rising acceleration, and the other important point mentioned there, increasingly complex, with implications and likely consequences not easily foreseen, maybe foreseeable, but certainly not easily foreseen. Increasingly, therefore, difficult to manage impact, outcomes, increasingly difficult. And that raises, again, profound ethical implications, which by and large go over the heads of the overwhelming majority of humanity, including many of those who are responsible for the innovations. I wanted to just touch base very quickly about, as I mentioned a moment ago, two existential threats that everyone talks about. And you know, of course, which ones they are. The next slide, please, Ben. And technology has been at the center of these two existential threats, of course. The first one, of course, the nuclear threat. It has its origins, as I think many of you will know, in the Manhattan Project in the 1930s going into the 1940s. And already it showed some of the important features. At its height, the Manhattan Project employed 100,000 people. Of those, only 12 knew what the project was really about. Only 12. And only one man really was at the helm. And that, the unaccountability of that is symptomatic of what we've seen demonstrated in many other areas in subsequent times. Of course, the weapon was used, and it has been with us ever since, though not yet used. It has been used in testing, of course, again with widespread repercussions for the people who have been subjected to the effects of nuclear testing, not least within Australia and in the Pacific. Now, you know that there have been two main periods, or at least many analysts break it up into two periods. The Cold War, which lasted about 30-odd years, from the mid to late 40s, right through to the late 80s, and then what people have generally referred to loosely as the post-Cold War period since. We know that there have been a number of nuclear-related accidents, but we also know that there have been major crises during the Cold War, which brought us very close to the actual use of the weapon, and two stand out, the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then it came, the Cold War, as we knew it, came to an end around the late 80s, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And for a while, it seemed, and there were agreements for nuclear disarmament, substantial agreements, agreed to by Gorbachev and Reagan. And it was thought this would usher in a new era. But that has not come to pass. Now, you can put this as a Camilleri assessment. We are closer to the use of nuclear weapons now than at any time since 1945. No question. No question. Closer. Why is that so? Not only because much of what was achieved with the end of the Cold War has now been dissipated. Virtually every agreement that was reached between Gorbachev and Reagan has now been abandoned, virtually. And the same, if you like, dynamic is at play. On the one hand, pitting the United States against Russia, and on the other, the United States against China, which may turn out to be the more significant conflict, emerging conflict. There is a thing called we can go to the next slide. There is a thing called the Doomsday Clock, which was established in 1947 by nuclear scientists as a way of telling us where they see the situation heading in relation to the potential use of nuclear weapons. And you can look at it. The slide tells you where it can go, the bulletin of the atomic scientists, and you can see how the clock has traveled since 1947. It was last changed, it was last reviewed in January of this year, and the decision was made not to move the hand. These are leading scientists, social scientists and natural scientists, who come once a year together and make that assessment. It's just their assessment. It stands at 90 seconds to midnight. Midnight is the actual use of the nuclear weapon. And that's the closest it's ever been since 1947. So it's not just me saying it, there are many others who come to the same conclusion. And it'll be fascinating, because it's done every January, what the decision will be in January of this coming year, 2025. Will they still leave it at 90 seconds to midnight, or will they move it a little bit more, even closer to midnight? It would not be surprising if they moved it to about 80 seconds to midnight.
What's the catastrophe you're talking about that it's moving towards? Because there's already been use of nuclear weapons. What about Japan? No. What are you talking about?
We're talking about, well, there could always be an India-Pakistan outburst, but that's not what is on most people's minds. That's a possibility. But it is either a US-Russia. Between them, they control 88% of the world's nuclear weapons. So they're the two to watch for a major confrontation. And the other one, of course, is US-China. So it'll be interesting to see whether it stays where it is. I think it's most unlikely that they will push it back, but it may stay where it is, or it may get even closer according to their assessment. Okay, so that technology hasn't caused the problem, but it is a crucial factor in the problem. The factors that led to its acquisition, to its maintenance, and to its development. There is, as you probably know, mass modernization of the nuclear capabilities of the major nuclear powers: US, Russia, and to a lesser extent, China. All right. Now, climate. We see something similar, but over a longer period of time, with again technology obviously playing a key role. With the steam engine came the first industrial revolution, the mechanization of production and transport, and the large-scale burning of fossil fuels, coal in particular, at that early stage. And then came the advent of electricity and the second industrial revolution. And then we know the rest, history, the diesel engine, the jet engine, host of other technologies, telephone, many other forms of communication, etc. And what all this has done is sustain an ongoing increase in consumption and travel, which in turn led to an ongoing and expanding increase in carbon emissions. Obviously, technologies have made this possible. And it's technology in a certain social and economic context, where there was money to be made and power to be gained from pursuing this path. So it was done with alacrity and abandon. And we're struggling to undo this as best we can. And whether we will or we won't remains an open question. Okay, so moving on. This brings us to a number of important ethical questions. Emerging technologies assure us of one thing: change will be even faster than it has been in the past, in the recent past even. It will go faster than anyone could possibly have imagined even 20 or 30 years ago. And here we're referring to a whole range of technologies, some of them interconnected: artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, genetic engineering, not just of plants, not just of other animal species, but generic engineering of the human body, autonomous vehicles, nanotechnology, and much else. So this raises profound questions. for what we understand to be human consciousness, what we understand to be human agency. Is there agency in human beings? Do they make history, or are they made by it? Technologically driven history. And ultimately, the ethical implications for life, full stop, all life. And ethical discourse in all of this has been lagging behind, greatly lagging behind. What those who are engaged in many of these developments, I don't say it disrespectfully, I'm just stating it as an observation of the evidence, don't know about ethics, would fill the books of many lives. What they don't know about the ethical wisdom accumulated over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years would be immense. Oh. So, now, there is an increasing understanding that this is a troublesome situation. So over the last 10 or 15 years, a lot more attention is being paid to ethical questions, including by those enterprises, engineers, technicians, who are engaged in working on these developments. But they remain, the ethical concepts they use are very superficial, very superficial. They don't really go to the nub of things. And that's why we need philosophers, psychologists, and others in the social sciences to bring some light to bear on these questions. You see a lot about fairness, privacy, well-being, even human flourishing. But what do they mean in practice? What do they mean? Whose well-being? Whose well-being? Similarly with the idea of sustainability. What is being said about sustainability? And similarly with ideas of justice. Justice for whom? These are very important questions, which are basically not answered, or at least not dealt with in any depth. There is a tendency insofar these ethical ideas apply, they apply to the user of these technologies. Not very well sometimes, but at least they apply to them, but they don't apply to the non-users quite so well. And those who are in crying need are, in the first instance, the non-users of these technologies. For some who regard the relief of suffering as the primary ethical principle, you would want to know what it does for those in need in Sudan, not what it does for the relatively comfortable in the US or even China, in the first instance. So, a second issue. Much of this ethical discussion, I have to hurry up a bit, much of this ethical discussion lacks social context. You can't just put a technical innovation, the conception of it, the design of it, the development of it, the adoption of it, into a structure, a political structure, an economic structure, a social structure, a cultural structure, without being impacted by that structure. And so, yes, you can put any number of innovations, but they're going to be tainted by the structure within which they operate. And much of the ethical discourse so far has paid very little attention to social, political, and economic structure. How do they respond to the question of the structure of power, of wealth, and of knowledge? And culture. You can't expect the ethics of a particular technology to be a lot better than the ethical culture within which those who make those innovations possible operate within. You can't expect people who are misogynist, and Silicon Valley is notorious for its approach to the role of women, the individuals, many of them. Much has been written about that. How to then integrate into their platforms a deeper respect for women in all its forms. Now, this is not in any way, none of what I'm saying is to doubt the potential value that some of these technologies, positive value, can contribute. I'm just saying that there is a need to broaden the ethical compass within which we make an assessment of what's positive and what's not. And that leads to the question of education. Those who are responsible economically, technically, intellectually for innovation, technological innovation of one kind or another, ought to have the best possible ethical education that money can buy. And they don't. Normally, there are exceptions through self-education. So the question of education is very important. And then thirdly, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, there's the problem of you may have principles, but how do you make sure that you review them to see how well they're being implemented? And if they're not, how do you make sure that the people responsible, the industries responsible, are held to account with full transparency of who's doing what and who's earning what and when and how? All right. So if we're going to think about doing better next, there are certain key, if you like, landmarks or key pointers. The first, innovation from the earliest stage, initial conception, right through to final adoption and distribution, has to be aligned with clearly specified ethical objectives that are readily understood by those who are introducing the innovation and by the wider public. And it can't just stay at the level of principle. You've got to translate the principle into desired outcome, specific outcome, specific objectives, desirable objectives. And they have to be integrated, these desirable objectives, in meaningful ways into data sets, production pipelines, and product features. And one of the principles, the ethical principles, can't be profit-making. It's not an ethical principle. Doesn't mean that people shouldn't be able to earn a decent income, but maximization of profit remorselessly is not an ethical principle. These issues are so important that it's not good enough to be left in the hands of a few. However clever they may be, however enterprising they may be, it has to be made the subject of public discussion. Ethical principles that do not involve an ongoing dialogue within a society are not worth the paper on which they're written. And the next, of course, is investment of resources. If one is to adopt, maybe, the ethical principle advanced by Metzinger last week, which is effective altruism, or a form of utilitarianism, you have to ask whether behind every cent that is spent on activity X or endeavor Y provides the best possible positive results for entire communities, and at the end of the day, the entirety of humanity. That's the ethical principle. And the dialogue that I refer to ultimately has to ask the most important and profound question. What does it mean to be human? What is it? Thomas Metzinger, who's meant to be speaking with us but can't tonight, believes that to be a central question which needs to be addressed and confronted and underpin technological change. Not prevent technological change, but underpin it. In other words, what are the social, cultural, spiritual needs and aspirations which make humans human? And how then can human consciousness and human agency be put at the center of that process? And finally, I mean, there's a lot more than what I'm saying, but finally, for my purposes, the processes of oversight and governance. Technology should not be advancing in the absence of adequate oversight, which means public oversight, hence transparency and accountability, and governance arrangement, which makes sure that oversight is supported wherever necessary by the means at the disposal of public institutions. Oversight and governance. So there you are, just a few ideas to which our appetite for some thinking. It's not meant to be a complete exposition of the very complex issue, just as it is starting point. Any questions? Yes. Yes. Either you have a loud voice, Rod, or you use a microphone.
I can do a loud voice, Joe.
Oh, good.
Can
Can it be heard?
you hear me?
Maybe you stand, that might make it better.
Just on the last point you were making about appropriate oversight and community or human oversight of the technological development. Totally agree. How do we do that in a society where some individuals have massive wealth and therefore power and ability to go and research and develop and innovate whatever they think is important, and to hell with everybody else? You know, I'm thinking of our mate, Mr. X, Mr. Tesla, whatever you want to call him, who can develop whatever he thinks is a good idea and impose it on the rest of us.
Well, I mean, that's a question of structure, you see. Structures, economic, social, political, allow these impacts, these results to occur, okay? So, an ethical approach to change, technological change, amongst other kinds of change, has to call into question structures which are fundamentally unjust. You can't have a just technology operating within unjust structures. At least you ought to be on the road, making some steps towards remedying the injustice. And technological change should see its role, ethical question, as contributing to that process. It can't be done overnight, but it has to move in that direction for it to be ethically based. So where there are extraordinary disparities of power and wealth, extraordinary disparities, which remain largely obscure in their day-to-day operations and certainly unaccountable, then obviously that's a red signal that something needs to be done about it. And so, and for this you need dialogue. Just get your mind around the problem, and you need the technical experts, the scientific thinkers, but also you need the philosophers, the ethicists, the social scientists, those engaged in various professions to be engaged in an ongoing dialogue. And that's what we don't really yet have. And maybe it's something to aspire to. Easy said, but hard to do.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested to build on that, actually, to take it, to ask your thoughts really on our chances of setting up a structure at an international level, because it seems to me that we have, we live in a society where there's free movement of capital between countries, there's a weakening international rules-based order, and I think there's a strong argument that in countries or jurisdictions where they have imposed some sort of ethical framework on development of technology, such as in the EU, that it has a backlash from people who say, well, then the money and the technology is just going to go elsewhere. So you're sort of cutting off the hand to slight So
well, there is a specific question in that, and the more general one underlying that line of inquiry. And Metzinger will tell us something about what should Europe do, because he's German, he's European focused, and he's aware of the China option, and he's very critical of it. So you can look at it that way, but in fact, Metzinger, I'm anticipating some of what we're going to hear, it's a little bit on the pessimistic side, not destroying hope. But he thinks if you're going to face up to the facts, it looks as if just the evidence we've got, humanity is not up to it. Can't rise to the challenge. It hasn't got what it takes. Doesn't mean you stop. You don't stop, but you've got to face the fact you may not succeed. You may not succeed. But he says that it's in the trying, not in the succeeding, that humanity raises itself a notch. In the trying, not in the succeeding. Because not to try is to give up, or to give up altogether. So that's the bigger question, whether at this point in time, humanity has the emotional equipment, the psychological, social, cultural equipment to address the many crises that it faces, of which some of the ones we're dealing with are just examples, they're not the only ones. It's the same applies to climate change. And he argues that looking at the facts as we've now got them, and what we've done so far, and what we are expected to do, you'd have to say, just looking at the facts, not your emotions, we're not going to get there. That's his assessment. And there are many others who would say that. But that doesn't stop you from trying any number of things, experimentally at least. You have to try, and see whether you can get over the hump. Anyhow, that's enough of that. Oh, so many.
Joe, I think we have a question online.
Oh, yes. Who's looking after that?
Hi,
Oh, you are. Okay.
go ahead, Sandy.
Thanks very much. Hello, my name's Sandy Killick and my organisation is Democracy Matters. And my question, Joseph, is why is it that the ethical discourse is lagging behind so greatly? And are there any locations where you see it happening in a healthy way, please?
The second part of the question, I don't think there are any geographical locations where you could say, oh, they're doing a pretty good job there, as opposed to other geographical spaces or population areas. I think it's happening in not insignificant ways, a bit everywhere. There are numerous people now trying to address the ethical implications of doing it this way, that way, proceeding in this direction or that. Not enough by way of a critical mass yet. What will it be like in 10 or 20 years? Well, it's anyone's guess. But there are lots of people, groups, many groups, that are applying their minds and their energies and their emotions to raising the level of ethical discourse, deepening the understanding and the dialogue. But at the moment, it still remains at a lower level that it would need to be for change to really begin to occur in a significant way. So there's a long way to go. We can all play our little part in some way. I don't know the sequence of hands, yes. Oh, is there another one online? We'll take it if there is. Yes, Christian.
Yes. Perhaps it's a bit more of an observation than a question, but one perhaps to reflect on. So that it's always struck me, and this is one area where I actually do a little bit of research myself, as a historian of science and technology, that we have a peculiar psychological relationship to many consumer technologies, which only allows us to weigh up the pros and cons of the individual device in our individual lives and not the consequences that ramify out from it. So an easy example often trotted out in the literature is the car, which of course makes it faster to go from A to B than it was beforehand. But no one really thinks about how much human effort it takes to build roads or sustain the industry, or how long you have to work to afford a car or maintenance, right? So we have this very small horizon of ethical analysis. And part of what I would like to see, and I perhaps wonder your thoughts, is one of the reasons we're lagging behind is that we don't broaden what we look at when we look at our technology. We look at a smartphone and we say, oh, amazing, what can it do? And we don't think through every domino effect that a society full of smartphone holding users would create, and all the social and other political issues that would come with that. Is that part of a vision about how we might broaden the ethical discourse?
Well, that's what those who are engaged in thinking about the ethical are, of course, asking for, or hoping for, or aspiring to. Yes, just as a little aside, in line with what you're saying, it's now 50 years since Ivan Illich showed, I think, reasonably clearly that we are traveling much more slowly through or mechanized transport than the Romans did 2000 years ago. In what sense? Of course, the car goes faster than the horse, of course. But the effort that goes into making the car, maintaining it, paying for it, and all its energy usage, etc., takes more hours per distance traveled than was ever the case for a Roman. So yes, that we need to think about those deeper implications. Yes, we're going faster, but it's eating up a lot more of our person time in order to get to that position of physically moving faster. The key, one of the keys has to do with what are the influences bearing upon any generation that's emerging. And it's difficult to avoid three big ones. They mightn't be the only ones, but they're three important ones. One, of course, is the household, the family, where you live, usually in the first 15 to 20 years at least of your life, and in many cultures even longer. So what the culture there, what does that do to your sense of dealing with those questions? And then formal education, which is now universally accepted as the thing to do, with some exceptions. What does it do to widening and deepening the ethical lens through which you view the world? How will equip our educational institutions from preschool to university to generate that interest in a higher and deeper level of ethical discourse? And then the media. So if those three areas of influence aren't working in a particular direction, then it's uphill all the way. So these are the three, they're not the only ones, but they're three important areas where you need to be thinking, how can it be changed around if you want to see some change along the lines we're discussing? Is there another one online? No. Okay. Yes.
One thing you didn't address when you made your initial assertion was about the threats to society or to humanity at the moment was the population.
Oh,
So
yes.
in 1900, the world's population was about 1.5 billion. In 1950, it got to 2.5 billion. In 2000, I think about 6 billion. And now it's about 8 billion, of which 2 billion live in what we generally describe as poverty. So how do you see, when we have a lot of clever people around making a lot of money, somebody addressing this problem?
Well, it is a complicating factor, of course, because not only is consumption rising for a good number, no means universally, but the number of those who are consuming is also rising, as you described. And of course, once you have the Americas and the European countries of this world, you can't confine it to them, the rising consumption. It's contagious. And of course, China wants to move in that direction. And there you're dealing with huge population centers. And so does India, and eventually, no doubt, parts of Africa and Latin America. So that compounds the problem greatly. And that's why some kind of population policy has to be looked at from an ethical perspective. It's complex and it's contentious, hand in hand with level of consumption. That too has to be looked at. There are people of whom it can be said ethically they consume too much, far too much, and they could lead very nice lives, very comfortable lives, consuming a lot less. So there are many, but you need the spaces, the institutions, the culture, the cultural settings within which all of these issues can be put on the table, and see what comes out of such discussion. And we're not doing it as well as we can or should, at least at this stage, as far as I can see. Last one, yes.
I just wonder if you have any knowledge of people working on the high efficacy that we give to adversarial problem solving as a society, and looking at the limits of that and the negatives of that as well as the positives.
Yeah. You're talking about conflict.
Yes, I'm talking about parliaments and the conflict that comes at that level of decision making so readily and so easily.
Yeah.
And every other area in which we use adversarial.
Yeah. Well, one simple observation is that powerful institutions look to technology, obviously, they look to technology all the time to buttress their power. Why wouldn't they? If they're in the business of accumulating and maintaining power, why wouldn't they look to technology to buttress that position? And very often, one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways in which they seek to buttress it is by encouraging technological advances and their application to the means of violence. That's one of the obvious observations. There are all kinds of rationalizations often, but they're only rationalizations. The reality is that force, coercion, and violence is first and foremost used to buttress power structures. There may be some secondary objectives, but usually they're not uppermost. I don't know, there was a webinar, I think yesterday or the day before, at which former Australian Foreign Minister was one of the lead speakers. And it was in relation to the US-Australia relationship. And as you probably know, he's become recently a fairly sharp critic of the Labor government. And he was saying, look, he said it publicly, I talked to many of these people. He was former foreign minister, Labor foreign minister. Of course, he talks to them. And when I confront them with the implications of certain of their decisions, they tell him, comes as no surprise to me because I have experienced it, I have some experience of it myself. They say to him, look, the implications you talk about, even if they are unpleasant of the kind you're imagining, they're not going to come about in the next 10 years. We'll be gone by then. We won't be in power for another 15 years. Someone else can worry about it. No. But for us, it's advantageous here and now because we're in the business of winning the next election. And to win the next election, we need to do X and Y, and we're doing it. And we're doing it for the Labor Party. We want Labor to govern. What happens in 10 or 15 years, not our problem. That's ethical discourse at its heart. All right, well, I think we've given it a reasonable go first up. Now, if we may go to the next item on our program, and if you look at it, we're going to break up into small groups for the moment. And there's a facilitator, I think, in most on those tables. If there isn't, join one that there is there, where there is one. Don't be one or two in one group, please. So I've given you 3 questions. You don't have to go through all of them. I'd be very surprised if you can go past the second one, the first and the second one. You won't be able to think have time to do it all, but very briefly, question one, just 2 or 3 minutes. Don't go into detail. Do you find it helpful when engaging in conversation to ask questions? To make it clear to the other stakeholder or participant in the conversation that you're really interested in knowing what they think. You ask questions. Do you find it easy, useful, etc.? Simple question, takes just a few minutes. The next question is more difficult and more demanding, but it's important. Now, I'll read it out just to concentrate the mind. Can we, nationally and globally, ensure that the design, development, and application of new and rapidly evolving technologies, including AI and many others, are aligned with ethical principles and principles like transparency, accountability, mental health, poverty reduction, human rights, etc., etc. Can these values be given a higher priority than profit making? If so, how? Now, we don't deal with that question. Don't deal with that question. The question is not that question. The question is the preceding 2 lines. Thinking of people in your network. We'll have networks. We discussed that last week. Thinking of the people that are in your network, from family to relatives to friends, colleagues, etc., 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 people you play sport with, and so on and so on and so on. Thinking of them, how would you go about introducing that question into conversation? How would you do it? Would you do it? And if you would, how would you do it? Share the how. Don't go into the ins and outs of the question. I think that, I don't think that. How can a question like that be made part of some of the conversations you engage with? You could say, look, hopeless. In my network, it would go down like a lead balloon. I don't do it. Okay, that's the reality. And you're frank about it, that's fine. Or yes, I'd give it a bit of a try. I do it this way in that circumstance, at that timing, etc. Or it comes naturally. I do it all the time. I can't stop doing it. And people just love it. Just share it. Okay, off we go. Oh, yes, and online participants, of course, will also break into their groups, and we have placed a number of facilitators to assist with that. So you'll be broken up into, I think, 5 groups with 5 facilitators. And hopefully it will all happen automatically. Okay, thank you. What? No, I think you're right. Thanks. Could we join the bigger room, please? The people online are now with us again. So, I hope you had some useful conversations. Hello? I hope you had some useful conversations, okay? And that you found some useful ways of getting interesting conversations going. All right? Can we please have, can I please have your attention? Okay. Now, next week, we're going to have a dialogue. The last time we had a series like this, it was a debate. And I think that can be a bit artificial because people are asked to argue the yes case or the no case, and that may or may not agree with their own views and assessment. So this time, we want 4 contributors to the dialogue to begin with, who will just tell us what their thinking is on the question that's there. It's a question to do with global warming because next week, climate change and the political process and how the two link up are central to what we're going to be discussing. So this will be one part of next week's discussion about climate change. So here's the question, or the statement. To avert disastrous global warming, we need drastic changes to the politics, lifestyles, and consumption patterns of the affluent West. Now, you're not supposed to agree with it, disagree with, do whatever you like with it. It is deliberately framed in a way that hopefully will provoke. So all we want is 4 people to volunteer, ideally 2 online and 2 in person, to speak to that statement from whatever angle or position they would like to. And then they will just make a 2-minute statement, that's all. And then they will have a discussion amongst the 4 of them for about a quarter of an hour. And then we'll invite the whole room, the virtual room and the room in person I have to stick here because of the camera, which I forget from time to time. That will be an opportunity for more people then to participate. And then we want 4 others, having heard very carefully what was said by the 4 contributors and what were the reactions of the wider group. What did they make of the dialogue? Did they find it informative, interesting, inspiring, or totally boring, or somewhere in between? We will hear from 4 others. So what I now need, or what we need, are volunteers, namely 8 people. 4 to take part in the dialogue, and another 4 to evaluate it briefly at the end of that particular session. Yes. You'll be one of those? All right. All right. 1. Let's see how many are interested. Now, what about the online people? There is a hand up. There are. Talita, where's Talita? Oh, can you tell there are a couple of people, I think, putting up their hands online. Just keep your hands up because we're going to take your name down. 1. How many can we see? I thought there were 2. Yes?
And there's a paper.
All right. 2. We need another one from here. I think we want a younger person, so we better go for it. Yes. Okay. Very good. And but we need another 4 to comment on what those 4 have been saying. So 2 more from here. 1, 2, and then from the online people. someone to comment on what they've heard next week. Don't all rush. What about you, Ava? Ava, I was just wondering whether you might be
She already
interested.
has.
She's
Oh, she's already done. I'm so
Maureen
sorry.
and Catherine.
Sorry?
Maureen and Catherine.
All right. Maureen and Catherine. All right, we've got two from, that's it. We've got the 8. Wonderful. And we're looking forward to hearing from all of you and from the rest of the group next week. Okay, time for a break. And we'll be back around about 8 o'clock in just over a quarter of an hour. So have a drink, have something to eat, and we'll resume and we'll hear from Thomas Metzinger.
Hi everybody. I just want to ask you 5
Okay. Well, I hope everyone's suitably refreshed. And now we're going to hear from now, if people could take their seats, please. Now we're going to hear from our friend who unfortunately is in hospital, Professor Thomas Metzinger, and we wish him a speedy and full recovery. A word about him. He is Professor Emeritus at the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz and a member of the German National Academy. His work has taken him in three main areas: philosophy of the mind, cognitive science, and applied ethics. He's probably the world's leading philosopher of the mind. His past, just to tell you a little more, to get a flavor of what he's done and who he is the past president of the German Cognitive Science Society and of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. He is now attached at the Frankfurt Institute of Advanced Studies. He is the co-founder of German Effective Altruism Foundation, president of the Barbara Wengler Foundation. He's on the advisory board of the Giordano Bruni Foundation and much else. I won't go into all of it. He was awarded a senior professorship, honorary professorship by the German Ministry of Science, Education and Culture. From 2018 to 2020, he was a member of the European Commission's high-level expert on artificial intelligence. And 2021, he was awarded the Pufendorf Medal. 2022, he was elected to the German National Academy of Science. Okay, well, we haven't got him live. However, he did point me in the direction of what might be useful ways of getting to know a little bit of his thinking. So I have chosen two video contributions that he's made in recent times, and then I will present a PowerPoint briefly of something that he published just a few years recently, 3 or 4 years ago, a charter of principles for artificial intelligence, which has been very widely discussed. Okay, so the first we're going to see, which one is it? We're going to see I've got it here. I'm just trying to remember. Yes, 5 questions, which is addressing, of course, to a German audience in this particular case, but it could easily be to an Australian audience. So where he says Germany, you can substitute Australia, UK, wherever you happen to be, it would be just as relevant. So let's see.
Hi, everybody. I just want to ask you 5 questions. The first question is, do you want your children to be Uber drivers for Chinese tourists? So what you're maybe not aware of is that we are in a self-defense situation in Europe between Trumpistan and China. And if you look at AI risks, they come in different predictive horizons. The best documented risk is with the predictive horizon of 2030, and it has to do with massive unemployment through old-fashioned automatization. So we will face a steeper income gradient, increased inequality in society, dangerous patterns of social stratification, parallel societies. There are some studies who predict that 47% of the jobs in North America might be lost by 2030. This could go along with extensive wage cuts, a collapse of income tax, pressure on social security systems, might lead to populism and all the things you know. So the first thing is we shouldn't fool ourselves. We are in a very critical historical transition. AI is not a technology. It's a meta-technology that makes many other technologies better, and we are caught in the middle. And that self-defense situation in Europe means two things, basically. We have to defend the European way of life. We have to defend freedom of speech, human rights, privacy, democratic standards. And in a situation where the two main actors on the planet do not share our values anymore. So there is a simpler version of this. Very simple and down to the ground. We also have to defend our standard of living in this situation. This whole situation is also an economic challenge because unemployment will lead to populism and social unrest later. So bottom line is, for many reasons, we have to get this AI thing right. Here's my second question to you. Do you want autonomous lethal weapon systems in Europe? For example, killer drones that decide who to kill all by themselves. Analysts say there is a historical new level of the arms race between US and China above nuclear arms, and it has probably started 2010. It would be in the interest of Europe and Germany to dampen down this arms race on the level of artificial intelligence, but it's probably much too late. So I think offensive autonomous weapon systems should be banned and not be funded on European territory. The European Parliament has said the same thing. 28 countries have said they will not get into this and not develop AI weapons. Germany is not among these countries. So what is special? Special is that AI weapons are ever faster. The reaction times, the time windows become smaller. You have to take humans out of the loop. In the end, the systems will have to make military decisions all by themselves. If you want to call up a general at 2:45 in the night and ask for a decision, you have lost the war. So my question to you is, what do you want and what do you not want in terms of military applications of artificial intelligence? It is you, civil society, who has to make clear what kinds of military applications of AI you want in this country and which ones you don't want. The government will protect the interests of the arms industry. The impulse has to come not out of the political institutions or economy, but out of the public sector. So my second question for you is, what kinds of wars do you want to have in the future? Here's my third question. Do you want research that aims at creating artificial consciousness? That's my own field of research. I'm one of the guys who founded the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. I'm in this field for 35 years. Everybody should understand in this room, and every politician should understand, that there is a difference between artificial intelligence and artificial consciousness. Synthetic phenomenology, as it is also called. Artificial consciousness would mean real feeling, that it is something like to be that machine, an inward perspective, a sense of self. So I am very nervous about this, because most people think this is just science fiction, but there are already 4 labs in the world who actually try to realize artificial consciousness. They are esteemed colleagues of mine. I respect them. I know these people, and they're very smart. And I think that is something that should never happen for many reasons. One reason being that we could create artificial suffering, possibly in a very large number in cascades of copies or backup copies with conscious self models. So I think we shouldn't go there, and I have asked for a global moratorium on synthetic phenomenology until 2050. I think we shouldn't even recklessly risk the creation of artificial consciousness, inner experiences, unless we really know what we're doing. And there should be a ban on this kind of research, because we don't want to trigger a second-order conscious evolution on this planet that gets out of control. All of this is science fiction. That's what the industry says. That is no argument. Standard action theory tells you if the future damage is very high, even if there's a low probability of that actually happening, it is rational to invest resources into risk minimization right now. We all have to begin to think about the problem of artificial consciousness right now. Here's my fourth question for you. What is your positive vision? What do you want to do with AI? What do you want AI to do for you? One thing we have to do is we have to get away from all these negative scenarios, killer robots and so on. What we have to create is a positive global vision. We need an ethical approach that is global, that includes the foundational values not only of Western countries, but also Chinese values like harmony, compassion, or mindfulness. And that's a major job that has to be done by this generation. So what we need is a good, independent ethics for AI. How many of you have heard the concept of ethics washing? You know what greenwashing is? I've seen in the last 1.5 years in Brussels, I've seen what ethics washing is. That's when Google and all the big companies create ethical debates and ethical rules which they publish. The goal is to avoid enforceable law and any kind of regulation. So they try to do something that is not fake news, but fake ethics. Some non-binding rules they publish so they can postpone law and legitimate control by the society. That's what ethics washing is, and it's currently happening everywhere. We have about 80 sets of ethics rules on the planet, and most of them are created by the industry to stop lawmakers. Many good things are going to come to you. I think it's unethical not to use AI. Don't get me wrong, we don't want to stifle innovation, and we need AI to fight climate change, to defend the common good, for evidence-based social engineering, and maybe we can even use artificial intelligence to make democracy better than it is right now, more efficient and more transparent. So the question is, what is your positive vision? And that brings me to the last question I want to ask you, maybe later discuss with you. Will you defend the German Constitution under this pressure from the US and China? I don't know if you've noticed it. So far in the history of mankind, democracy, human rights, and technological leadership was always going hand in hand. This is now changing. If a non-democratic actor like China wins the global AI race, then your children will become Uber drivers for Chinese tourists. And you know, what we see in China right now is something we haven't seen in the history of mankind. totalitarianism to zero. And if non-democratic entities win this AI race, they will spread totalitarianism to zero all over the planet. So I think the biggest problem we have is digital sovereignty in Germany. We are not a sovereign state. You have seen 3 weeks ago that Microsoft and Google will actually do what Donald Trump tells them to do. You know, with the Android updates for Huawei, with the tech war that has started. But what nobody sees is that all German universities, the whole government, all of the German administration runs on Microsoft Windows with a lot of backdoors. Donald Trump can actually shut down this country at any point in time, and nobody seems to care about this. So we are not a sovereign state, and we have to regain this. It's now 30 years since the wall has come down, and you know we still have many problems. But I think what we need is a new kind of constitutional patriotism in this new situation. Digitaler Verfassungspatriotismus, a post-nationalist identity we create for the age of artificial intelligence. Don't look for the German government for this. You have to do it. Civil society has to do it. You have to think about what ethical rules you want for AI, and we have to somehow do it all together. Climate change and artificial intelligence and its rise are actually two very different things. But they have one thing in common. Just like climate change, AI will not go away. This will be with you until the end of your life. Thank you very much.
Now, the second one, which goes a bit more into artificial consciousness.
You sent in a proposal, but your manager has a full committee.
Hello, everybody, and greetings from an unexpectedly sunny spring day in Germany. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. My name is Thomas Metzinger, and I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Mainz in Germany. In these two presentations today, I want to try and make you see something you may not have seen before. In current philosophy, there are two hot topics, namely the ethics, the applied ethics of artificial intelligence, and the problem of consciousness. What I want to try today is if you can see the connection between these two fields of research. So in this first short talk, I want to talk about the problem of artificial consciousness and give a brief sketch of an argument why we should be very careful with implementing this. So from 2018 to 20, I have worked in the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. I have co-authored the ethic guidelines for trustworthy AI and the policy and investment recommendations for trustworthy AI. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I met very many smart people, 52 top-level experts on AI, and I definitely learned a lot. We published our guidelines on the 11th of April 2019 and the policy and investment recommendations on the 26th of June. However, there are some bad news. These ethics guidelines were strongly contaminated by industrial lobby, and actually, from a philosopher's point of view, they are a lot of hot air. There's no real normative substance. There are no real concrete recommendations and applications. And for example, all red lines have been taken out of the final document. I think they're also short-sighted because they deliberately ignore some long-term issues. And here are some examples of issues the high-level group deliberately ignored. The problem of artificial general intelligence, the problem of possibly autonomous moral agents emerging, and the problem I want to talk about today, artificial consciousness, or as it is sometimes called, synthetic phenomenology, alluding to synthetic biology. So here's the first technical term you have to learn. I understand some of you have to go through a test at the end of this course. So the new term is ethics washing. This is if you organize and cultivate ethical debates because you want to delay, postpone, avoid, or deter people from policymaking and regulation. So there are people who have an interest in these ethics debates going on just to buy themselves time. I think what we really need and what we urgently need is binding rules which are also enforceable and which are legitimate because there's a full democratic process behind them. The good news, however, is that the current European ethics guidelines are much better than anything China or the United States actually have. And those current ethics guidelines are also an excellent first step, a plateau to begin a second phase of discussion and to develop them further. So what we can actually do is we can move the discussion back from a place where it is dominated by industrial lobby, which just wants to decorate a major investment strategy by making it look ethical, into a more constructive and intellectually honest context. Maybe that is here, but I will confine myself to one single topic today, synthetic phenomenology. I'm one of the guys that founded the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness 27 years ago, and I've been working in the consciousness community for 30 years of my life. There's something that is slightly beginning to make me nervous. There are 4 labs now on this planet with esteemed colleagues of mine, people who I really like and take them really seriously, who basically say, we want to create artificial consciousness and we're going to do it as soon as we know we can do it. So here you have, for instance, a statement from Stan Dehaene and his group in Paris. They want a confluence of AI and the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. But you also have in Tokyo, for instance, Ryota Kanai. There's now Tsuchiya in Melbourne. And here's the typical American way of putting the point. Michael Graziano from Princeton, also a very well-known consciousness researcher. One could build it for entertainment value. It would be monumentally cool. I'm not so sure. So my main thesis is a political demand. We should impose a global 30-year moratorium on all research that knowingly risks or directly aims at the creation of artificial consciousness. And I think there should be a worldwide ban on synthetic phenomenology until 2050 or until we know what we are doing. So what is the risk description? What do we want to avoid? I think we could create conscious suffering on non-biological carrier systems. We could have negative phenomenology, possibly in a very large number of individuals. Think of cascades of copies or cascades of virtual agents. I call this the explosion of negative phenomenology. It's not an intelligence explosion, but an explosion of artificial suffering. But there's a problem of epistemic indeterminacy, and I'm going to explain in a second what this means. We might not even be aware of it because we don't have a theory of consciousness. Basically, we don't know what we are doing in this field at all. So here is from an article, which I'll come back to later, that will be published in about a week or 2 weeks, and which will be freely available for everybody. What is epistemic indeterminacy? This means that it is not the case that either we know that artificial consciousness will emerge at some point, or that we know that artificial consciousness will never be instantiated on machines. It is this neither norness, I think, that we have to deal with in an ethically sensitive way, and in a way that's evidence-based, rational, and intellectually honest. And this is also an important point. I am not saying, I've been in this field for 30 years, this will happen tomorrow, and I don't believe that it will happen the day after tomorrow. But my point is that it doesn't matter what I'm actually thinking. The problem is this indeterminacy, not that I'm making a statement towards probability. So let's have a look at the applied ethics for AI. My background assumption is that what gives an entity moral status is the capacity for conscious suffering, and that in this world, reducing suffering must always have greater priority than increasing happiness. I'm firmly convinced that there's more suffering than joy in this world. A brief aside, AI and robot ethics has a lot of strong parallels to animal ethics. Take this classical quote from Arthur Schopenhauer, the assumption that animals are without rights and the illusion that our treatment of them has no moral significance is a positively outrageous example of Western crudity and barbarity. Universal compassion is the only guarantee of morality. So please note that tomorrow's self-conscious machines have no representation in any ethics committee on this planet or in any political process. But we need to know what that thing is. What is suffering? Very simple definition would be any kind of state the system would avoid if it had a chance. Massive prediction errors in the system's self-model, in particular for negative effect, unexpectedly decreasing rates of prediction error minimization, loss of self-control, and negative balances, negatively valued states in the system's conscious self-model. So what I want to do now is I want to briefly give you 4 necessary conditions for what might be.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit
I'm going to do that. That gives you a flavour. And what I think I will now do, to round it off, we've been hearing from Professor Metzinger for about 20 odd minutes. One of his most important contributions in the public arena, in the public space, to which he referred, was the development of a charter, a global charter. And I'm going to take you through the main points of this article. That's it. That's quite a lengthy article, or actually it's a chapter, and I'm going to just pick the key points. So it's still Metzinger speaking to us. A global artificial intelligence chart. Some key points, he goes into much detail in the full written piece, but we're just extracting some of the key points. And they come in a series of recommendations, so we mustn't go away from the camera. Right, if we could have the next one. Okay. The first one is simple. He's inviting the European Union to develop its own charter, and then to become a leading force for the adoption of a global charter. In other words, if you're going to go global with a thing like this, you need some muscle, and he's hoping that the European Union, if it adopts its own, would then be in a position to have that muscle to support the cause of a global China. Okay. That's the first two. And then he's recommending resources to strengthen international cooperation and coordination and reduce strategic mistrust, which of course leads new technologies, including artificial intelligence, to be placed at the service of negative pressures or currents as opposed to positive ones. And the key word there is resources, to invest very substantial resources, which can begin to at least compare with the resources that are devoted to doing the opposite, which is military hardware and software. So he then goes on to say, in his introduction, that, have we got the next one?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Interesting. All right, there has to be a public debate, a public discussion. That's what I meant by debate, a public conversation on artificial intelligence, which then percolates through to the political institutions themselves. It may be that the political institutions don't take the initiative, but ultimately it has to percolate through the political institutions, even though they may be changed in the process. So, unless this is done, his fear is that the values, the real value that will guide AI development will be set by a relatively small number of human beings. And within that group, small group of human beings, large private corporations and military institutions will be calling the tune. So you've got to try and break through that concentration of power and wealth by opening it up for the entire public to have the option to participate. And one of the expected outcomes to emerge from that public discussion is to try and set a set of ethical and legal arrangements, which minimize the negative use of this technology or set of technologies, and which maximizes the beneficial use. And implicit in that is oversight and, if need be, overruling. You cannot do this. And if you do, you'll be fined and possibly jailed. Simple. You do as the ethical principles require, and you're accountable. You're accountable. And then he talks about, I'll go through this very quickly now, the prevention of an AI-driven arms race, which he regards as terribly important. He did hint that he thinks we may already have missed the bus on this, but he still maintains that that is an objective that should be pursued. And again, he's saying, let's try and commit resources and the application of AI for purposes which are the opposite of a rapidly expanding arms race. And for that, that means developing a wide range of political, diplomatic, and other instruments in which the community sector plays an important role. As we've said, we heard before, going on to artificial consciousness, he has the grave concern that of this possible development. So he's arguing for a ban, as we've heard, until 2050 or sooner, if we really feel we know exactly what we're doing and we can foresee the implications and the consequences. And that requires, for that to happen, that's the important point, for that to happen, we have to have, a significant number of people, large numbers of people, have to have an understanding. And you can see how 2050 might be optimistic, have to have an understanding of what constitutes conscious experience. What is consciousness? And after 30 years of intense study and research, he says, we still don't know. We still don't know. You should hear him unpack consciousness, and every conceivable answer you have, it is demolished. It is demolished. And I have never heard anything quite extraordinary demolition job. What we don't know about consciousness, self-awareness, and in particular, what is really the meaning and significance of suffering? Do you really know? You feel it, but do you really understand it, its meaning, and how we are to respond to it? Okay, that's artificial consciousness and revolving around his particular particularly strong interest on consciousness and suffering, the two key ideas that drive the Metzinger theoretical framework. Next, the technology must be used in ways that do two things. It must avoid division, polarization, and ultimately, of course, violence. And it must reduce the disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor. It must have that as a central objective. And it must be measured and evaluated according to how well it contributes to that objective. It can't do it on its own, but it has to contribute to it. We go on to the next item, research ethics. Well, he's already spoken about a code of ethical conduct, but not just about the application of technology, in this case, artificial intelligence, but code of conduct even for the researchers. And it's not a code of conduct, could you please do it? Could you please bear this in mind? You will do it, or you will suffer the consequence. You will, because it is backed, assuming this to be the case, by the will of the polity. We want the research to go on, but it has to be ethically based. And that requires close attention to the consequences of the potential consequences of the research being undertaken. And the last heading of his this particular set of proposals, meta-governance. The idea being relatively straightforward. We're in the business of maximizing the positive and minimizing the negative. Not just as a wish list, and a wish, but we have a set of principles, a set of processes, a set of directives, all moving towards that and constantly under review in case it's not working as it should, constantly under review. And at all times, transparent and accountable at all times. And that tells you, says Metzinger, that the institutions we have, political institutions, the structures of the state and the international agencies which bring states together are not at the moment fit for purpose. It is radical. They're not fit for purpose. They can't rise to the challenge unless they undergo change themselves. It's not just that they should oversee how the dramatic changes unfold over time. They themselves have to change in order to be able to perform the task with a degree of efficiency and effectiveness that's required. So governance structures themselves have to be under scrutiny, not just the technology. The government structures which oversee the technologies and how they develop, operate and function, the government structures themselves have to be put under the magnifying glass. And for that, we must devote resources in order for this change of government structures to take place. In other words, you have to do a massive funding job of getting national and international conversation underway. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, to enable the conversation to proceed in a systematic and inclusive way. So from technology is moved to governance. He understands that there is a very close link between the two. You can't do the right thing by technology unless you have the right institutions to know and be able and be willing to know how to do it and be able, willing to do it. And then he concludes, this is the last little bit, a quotation from the foundation that he helped establish. The precautions that he has in mind, I've already suggested this, are going to be expensive. Expensive. But as he likes to say, governments have no qualms going to the people and say, we will spend tens and hundreds of billions of dollars on weapons. No problem. It's for national security. What is needed at this time is precautionary measures involving conversation at the national and global level, and it'll cost money. It has to be a major budget item. So when the annual budget comes through, Australian, French, European Union, anybody, you'd want to say, how much is being spent on this? And how does it compare, for instance, with the police budget or the defence budget? How many Australians are asking that question? But he does. And he admits that even well-meaning experts don't always agree. There's a difference of opinion. And when there is a difference of opinion, disagreement, which is perfectly fine, all the participants, he suggests, ought to have the modesty and the humility to recognize they may not be right. Everyone who participates in the dialogue, however brilliant the mind might be, must acknowledge they may be wrong, including himself. He often says, I may be wrong. So that's another bit of Metzinger. As you can see, he's dealing with very big issues and he's not afraid to do it. You saw those two little clips we've had. I would say, as of now on YouTube, there are probably dozens, if not hundreds of them. So he makes the rounds. Okay, I can't answer questions. I can't answer for him. There's no way I could even pretend to, but people might have a few comments they want to make, thoughts that may occur to you. Yes, please.
And I think it's probably a little politically naive, you know, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine the other day about who determines US government policy. And, well, you know, I always pretty well knew, but it became obvious last month when with the fiasco with Joe Biden, that of course it's the donors. The donors control everything. Without the donors, nothing happens. So I think you would have a big problem convincing the donors, especially if they sort of put money somewhere. And the donors are the big tech companies, the military industrial complex, the whole gang.
Yeah, well, you pointed to one of the problems in existing political structures. It exists in many countries, of course, including Australia, not on the scale of the United States, where billions of dollars are exchanged, literally billions of dollars. I think you've heard that over the last 6 weeks, the two contending candidates for the presidency have just in a few weeks amassed over $1 billion in just a few weeks. So that, and of course, where does that come? Well, there is an element of people putting in $10 and $20, but a lot of it is not from those who put 10 and 20. So yes, it's a problem, and it's a structural problem. In theory, of course, you understand it's theory. I'm not answering for Metzinger. I don't know what exactly he would say to that particular question, but theoretically, you can make, by law, put an end to all donations. Okay, legislate. That's it. It becomes illegal. You're found doing it in spite of it being illegal. You end up with severe penalties. You can do it, but of course, the question is, where would such an impetus come from? It's unlikely to come from the recipients. It's unlikely to come from the donor. It can only come from third parties who are observing that this is going on and who may not like what is going on. Okay. Any other comments, thoughts?
One of the issues that I find really interesting is the issue of governance, and that's something that our team spoke about earlier, and was interesting to have it, you know, referenced in Dr. Metzinger's paper as well. And I found it very interesting when he said that governance structures themselves have to change, not just the way that we monitor technology. We need to change the way that we even do the practice of governance. So one of the questions I would have asked him was, what examples could we have? Something that I find fascinating is watching that process play out for social media platforms. I once watched a documentary, and it was basically a bunch of Silicon Valley developers turning against the major social media platforms, and then basically exposing how sinister their tactics are and how addictive they are and how harmful they are on children. And so I find it interesting, you know, when we think about new governance practices, we need to rely on people who are at the forefront of these technologies to kind of like cross the river and then be the good guys. And what are the ethical dilemmas of such an approach? So that's probably something I would ask him if he was here.
Well, we might still get the option, we'll see. And if he gets better, he might be able to join us at least for a period and answer questions like that. Anything else? Anyone? Anyone online has a thought they'd like to share?
There's been some written stuff, yeah.
Sorry, who?
There's been some written submissions.
Oh, okay. Can someone read them out? Talita, would you like to read something out?
And how biological organisms experience.
Can you be heard?
No. No, Can non-biological organisms experience suffering? Embodiment seems necessary for consciousness, partly as consciousness is an iteratively integrated feature of evolution that developed gradually from cellular organisms.
Question. Anything else?
I'm just not married to the idea. But yeah, what is suffering if you're non-biological?
Oh, yes. Well, that's something he talks about a lot, and he's written entire books on the subject. And you may wish to perhaps get hold of a book from the library or purchase it. The Elephant and the Blind, and the Ego Tunnel. And then he goes deeply into those questions. They're both meant to be a bit more accessible for the non-technically minded, technically trained person, but they're still complex. But nevertheless, they're accessible. So that's all I can do, point you to that. But he certainly argues that to suggest that the entities that may well come to pass over the next 30 years, 20, 30 years, could well have consciousness and could well experience suffering. That's his point of view, based on a lot of thought and research. Not everyone has to agree with that, but you have to hear the case. And he would see it as another radical step in the evolutionary process that we would need to think very carefully about before we hope to make it happen. That's his position. Yes, this entity, he argues, this entity that will have created, which engages in a highly intimate dialogue with this or that human or group. Suppose that it was to be subjected to abuse. Suppose it was threatened with bringing its life, if I can use that word, to an end, would cause immense suffering. And it would be even worse, that then that entity would seek to retaliate and cause also human suffering. So all that, you know, it tries to develop all that in fine detail. And again, he says, he's not predicting that this will happen. He is raising the possibility that it could happen. And even if it's only a possibility of 5 in 100 or 1 in 100, it is a possibility so serious that some precautions have to be thought of in detail before we go down that road. So anyhow, I can't do more than that in a sentence or two, and certainly not on his behalf. Anything else?
Colin Mitchell is making a case for consciousness, conscious machines also having a good time, not just necessarily suffering. So what assumption is there that we think it would suffer?
Oh no, he wouldn't be arguing, just to clarify this, he wouldn't be arguing that it would be all suffering, any more that it is all suffering for human beings. But there is a good deal of suffering among human beings, in some places more dramatic, more ongoing than in others. You know, we mentioned all those places at the last session. There's an awful lot of suffering. Yes, of course, there is the other thing as well, and presumably they would have access to that. But he comes at it from an angle we desperately need to lower the level of suffering. We have to be committed to lowering the level of suffering. And here is an option, a possibility, at least there, that the amount of suffering and the depths of suffering could even intensify, when in fact we should be going in the opposite direction. That's why he says moratorium. And he's not saying because it will happen, or that he knows it will happen, or that it is a prediction of high probability, but of sufficient probability to merit serious consideration and caution. Yeah.
Metzinger does draw a parallel between AI consciousness and animal suffering. Just to comment on that.
Yeah.
But my main point is, he's talking about quantum leap. We are at the moment pessimistic even about this basic power structures that we are in. So I don't see how we can get to that point.
And handle it.
Yes.
All right. How we go? Yes, time, clock, the clock. Anything else? Any comments? Is it- Oh, yes. Someone online?
Robert is saying, I think the claim that we don't have an agreed definition of consciousness is true to the extent that there are different schools of thought, but we do have developed definitions and supporting evidence. To just claim we don't know what is consciousness is dismissive of the advances in consciousness research.
Okay.
And the next comment from Ava, arguably we know what consciousness is more than anything else, given we're unavoidably in it. The issue defined is defining it. We can't prove a system from the inside or one risk circularity.
Well, very interesting and worth pursuing ideas and thoughts. And as I said, online you can get much more detailed exposition of his thinking in his various presentations, if you would like to, or if you want to get one of his books. Only 2 major books have been published in English, although others have been published in many other languages. But there may be another one coming in English, I'm told, in the next couple of years. All right, well now we just thought about next week. We move in a less philosophical plane, although no doubt ideas will be central, where we're going to talk about not just climate change, but certainly climate change, but we're going to talk about the interface between climate change and government, and in particular, the democratic idea in government. So Tim Hollow, who has just written a book in the last, I think 12, published in the last 12 months, very much addressing that issue. He has established the Green Institute, based in Canberra, and I don't know whether he's particularly involved with the Greens at this time, maybe, but he was the communication officer for Christine Milne when she was the leader of the Greens nationally. So he has a strong inclination there. The other string is to his bow is that he's an accomplished musician. He's a relatively young man. Anything under 50 is a youth. And he has, I believe his group has produced 7 albums. He's performed at Carnegie Hall. So I'm trying to persuade him to give us about 5 minutes of his music. If he's willing. We'll see. We'll see. All right, for next week. And try and encourage anyone you know who may be interested to join us. They would be most welcome. Okay. What?